Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. Today I will be painting this awesome nutcracker whom I have dubbed Sir Nuttingham. It is a wonderful piece that will look fantastic with or without fancy decorating. Prepare to be amazed as I share my tips and tricks to make this a quick and easy project. Whether you are a beginner or painting for fun, grab your brushes and let's get started. This is a 12-piece kit, and because it's MDF, I do seal it with multi-purpose sealer and lightly sand it. Just tracing the face area. When I base coat, I'm going to use 2 to 3 coats of warm beige, and I make sure to dry in between coats, but cut that part out because it's kind of redundant and time-consuming. I am painting outside the trace line just to make sure that there are no void areas when that outer face piece is put back on. Painting both sides and the side edges of the nose with warm beige as well. Using my 1/2 inch awesome angle to shade dried clay around the outer edge of the face and also on that side edge of the nose. I did later on do the chin as well. The eye stencil, I wanted to make sure that it was going to be in the correct space, so I did put the face piece back on, and just to keep everything lined up perfectly, and I secured it with a piece of painter's tape. Load my spectacular stencil with Snow White to stencil the eyes, and I'm using my painter's pal just to mask around so I don't get paint on the background. The eyebrows are slate gray. Make sure to wipe that brush off before stenciling so that you remove most of the paint on a paper towel. That way it eliminates any running under of the stencil and keeps those crisp edges. Painting the hair, the beard, the mustache with that same slate gray. Try to pull the paint towards the outer edges. Helps prevent running down. Now I did notice when I put the eyes on there that they weren't perfectly spaced, so I had to paint one and then adjust the stencil and stencil the other one. And I'm using sapphire for that. Started to shade under the eyes with a 1/2 inch awesome angle, but the 1/4 inch is easier to get that smaller detail, so I did bump down to 1/4 inch. Too much shading under the eye will make him look kind of tired. Shading under the eyebrow as well, and then a little bit of Snow White around the outer edge of the iris. Dip dot soft black pupils because it creates a hump when you dip dot. I went back in with the handle end of my brush and just lifted out excess paint. Putting a little shadow on across the top of the eye with soft black. That just helps the eyes to recede a little bit more, and add that Snow White sparkle highlight. And making sure I get the positioning for the cheeks using my stencil brush and watermelon slice, wiping it over a paper towel to remove excess paint. I build both cheeks up at the same time. Now to do the eyebrows, I used my Epic script liner and Snow White, shading a little bit of soft black on the bottom edge, and afterwards I go back with Snow White to brighten them up, whiten them up, and really make them look full and kind of fluffy. Load that Epic script liner well. You can get a lot of strokes out of it if it is loaded correctly. If not, add a little more water and that paint will really flow off. Number 2 radical round to put some sand gray on the mustache and beard, but then I decided the incredible comb is going to work much faster and really fills it up nicely. And I like the end results much better. Doing the same thing with Snow White, and I'm pulling in the direction that the hair would lay. There will be many layers. If it's not looking good, after many layers it starts to come together and it's going to look fantastic. Started from the bottom and pulled those layers down on the beard. And a little bit of soft black shading helps to create that dimension and depth. Just a little bit of paint makes a big difference. That's my motto. I feel like I can fix anything, so I don't let it stress me out. This is my fun time. I like to play with colors and paint and add those layers and get some amazing results. I'm using my 1/4 inch awesome angle, which is an angle I designed. It's a little bit longer. Gives you more stroke work before you have to reload. I was going with the Epic Script Liner on the hair, but again, that incredible comb is so wonderful. It just even looks better. And working with that Epic Script Liner wasn't getting my results. This looks so much better. This brush is designed to create that look of fur or hair, so allow it to do its job, and it just makes painting so much quicker and easier, and actually will look even better. Make sure that the paint is thinned. Use just the tips to keep that hair thin and fine and flowing well. And I do go back with several layers. I think that's much better than trying to get it all at once. Now where the mustache meets, I'm going back with my Epic Script Liner to really define that area and smooth it out and make it not look scruffy. I need it to look soft and flowing. This is where the detail work comes in. Everything prior is quick and easy. A little bit of stroke work, line work really finishes it off and makes it look fantastic. The hat was painted slate gray, and I'm using my 1/2 inch awesome angle to float soft black around the edges. I wanted that center to be just a little bit brighter. Maybe it's more the center left. And I did this a couple times. Same thing on the boots. Slate gray base, and then I'm just roughing in. I think roughing in is kind of a good word to get that dimension and the shape of the boots. And I'm letting the toe of my angle create the divisions between the toe of the boot, shading around the sides. My paint is very loose, very thin down. I can work with it a fair amount of time before it starts to tack up. So if the paint's not moving around for a longer period of time, try a little more water on the brush. It makes a huge difference. I usually don't show this. Is where I put my pattern on, a little bit of graphite, and trace the design on there. I'm base coating the yoke area with melon. Putting that bright behind the red really helps to make it resonate and be a strong, pretty Christmas color. But I noticed it wasn't even, so I'm using my clear see-through ruler to get those dimensions and really make sure that it is the right. I don't have a pattern when I create these. It's my own in my mind, so I have to kind of wing it as I go along. But if it's not centered and if it's not even, that definitely will show up. Using sapphire to paint the jacket around the yoke, and there's a belt in that middle area, but I'm painting the tails now. This is such a pretty blue. And I'm painting all of the coat, the sleeves around the yoke with this sapphire. Again, it's going to take a couple coats. I omitted that part on the video just because for the sake of time, and that way you can put the video on hold, paint it, and then catch up. The pants I painted snow white because white is hard to cover. This takes about 3 or 4 coats. I did use my stencil just to kind of get that straight line. Anything you needed to use to get lines straight really makes the painting look much better than trying to just wing it and then it's a little off kilter. That part between the coat tails is melon, and then these are the cuffs and the shoulder pads, and I'm painting all of them melon as well. I use my stylus to hang on to these tiny little pieces. Just makes it much easier, and it doesn't leave maybe a little teeny dot. Now I am top coating with watermelon slice. Love that color. It's very pretty and vibrant. And I'm using my 1/2 inch awesome angle. I like to use the toe. It gives me that corner work, covers it well, and smooths it out nice and even. I have a longer bristle that gives me more brush time and less reloading time. That ends up in creating smoother strokes. Put a little piece of tape down there. I don't want to get red on the pants, and putting the watermelon slice over that. I'm using Prussian blue to shade the jacket, and I shade it everywhere, around the yoke, above and below the belt, down both sides of the sleeves. It just gives a lot of dimension very quickly and very easily. I did speed the film up, but I do paint quickly, and the paint is very loose, leaving a little area there for that gold trim. Just makes it easier visual to follow when painting. Now I'm doing deep burgundy around the outer edge of all of the red area, the yoke and that little part down below his belt. And it was a little bit offset, so I have to straighten that up when I put the gold trim on. And a little bit of deep burgundy around the outer edge of that. I did part of the jacket, and then I went back and shaded the rest of it, and that way I can enhance or deepen areas after it dried if needed. It's hard to work shading in both sides in those small areas, so letting it dry and then going back and shading it a little bit more helps eliminate that. Now, when I adjusted the size of that yoke, I made it smaller than the stencil, so to compensate for that, I'm just going to stencil half of those braids and buttons, and then I shifted the stencil over and I am stenciling the other half. On the original pattern, if you purchase it, and all the links below will be listed for the pattern and the pieces, the original line tracing will be of correct size, so you won't have to adjust or make any adjustments for the braid and the buttons. Using my 1/8 inch awesome angle to shade light cinnamon around those little buttons and across the bottom part of the braids. I love how just that little bit of paint starts to make those stand out and not look so very flat. Thought it needed a little bit of trim around the neck. I wasn't sure when I first started what I was going to do there, but I did paint that the yellow ochre, and I'm using to paint the trim around the yoke yellow ochre as well. And if you load your brush correctly, you should be able to get a nice long smooth stroke without having to reload, and that makes it so nice to keep a smooth flowing line. And look how nicely that paint flows on. If the paint does not flow on smooth and even, add a little more water to the brush, and it should go very, very nicely. And I use yellow ochre. You can use antique gold, marigold, any kind of a gold would be perfect for this. With all the shading, it doesn't matter. The brim of the hat or the headpiece is the same yellow ochre, a little bit of light cinnamon across the bottom, kind of consistent for everything that's painted this gold color, shading it with light cinnamon across the bottom, and just to give a little bit of dimension and richness. Same thing on the boot cuffs, just to smooth that in. I'm using my 1/8 inch awesome angle. It's a little bit tinier, much better control to put that in there. To do the belt, just position the stencil and stencil that in with soft black. It's so nice to have a stencil to do that. Piece of tape can also be used, but popping it in there that quickly and that perfectly is ideal. Having these separate pieces is wonderful because they don't have to be traced and hand painted. All of the gold pieces that are on his uniform are highlighted with Snow White, most generally on the top and the left side. Now, Snow White will dry just a little bit duller than when it's first applied, so often I will go back and add a second little bit of Snow White to brighten that up. And I do use my fingers to kind of smudge that out so that it's not so intense. Then when I go back and brighten it, it really starts to illuminate and become dimensional. The plume is melon, then base coated with watermelon slice, shaded with deep burgundy. I wanted this brim area to be a little bit like carved gold, so I'm kind of patchy, kind of floating it in so that it looks a little bit choppy. Loaded my Epic Script liner with thinned light cinnamon. Stay on the toe of that brush and let it just flow off and create a nice squiggly line. I did go back and highlight the top edge with deep burgundy to add a trim on that collar. A little bit of Snow White in there to make that sparkle. Shading a little bit more with light cinnamon on the edge of the yoke trim, all around his coat, the bottom trim as well. Make sure that every part has the same amount of shading. I didn't want the highlights to be smooth and even. I thought they should sparkle just a little bit. Using my Epic Script liner to add that little bit of decorative stroke work there at the bottom. A little bit of light cinnamon on the left side and a highlight of Snow White on the right. A little bit of sand gray to shade around the outer edges of the pants. Make sure they don't look dirty. This is a very soft color. Keep it light and very subtle. I decided to try the Incredible Comb to create the fringe on the shoulder pads. It looked great. I used yellow ochre and then I went back with Snow White to brighten, adding a little bit of sand gray highlights on the belt and shading and highlighting the buckle with light cinnamon and also with Snow White. And I did add a little bit of Snow White highlights on the squiggles on the hat trim as a highlight there also. A little bit of sand gray on the toe of the boots across the top of the sole. To do these little decorative strokes on the sleeve to get them even, I did take my white chalk pencil, just kind of put dots where the tips were. It just makes it easier to line those up and add the stroke work on that. And using Epic Script liner, put a little bit of thin soft black right below the jacket on the slacks and highlight the bottom of that middle part with melon. A little more decorative trim. This is so much fun to put trim and decorations on the uniform. A little bit of the same, a little bit of braid and I guess they're boot laces on the boots, and I used the yellow ochre, shade it with light cinnamon and highlight it with Snow White. Make sure that the laces cross over the same. This is a soldier, so everything has to be kind of regimented and perfect. I added the highlight so that the top one goes over, and then I wanted them to not just be on top of the boot but kind of sunk in. So going back to shade a little bit below each of these with some soft black, and that just helps to kind of put them in place. A little bit of highlight on the toe of the shoe. This is where I put that soft black under the buttons and the laces on the boot, and I decided I needed just a little bit of shading right where they cross over, and I'm glad I did it. It made a big difference. A little bit of paint makes a big difference, really makes it stand out. Anytime that I use the gold trim or decorations, just a little touch of light cinnamon on the bottom and Snow White on the top to help make those stand out. I did highlight the sleeves down the middle with a little dry brush of Snow White. The holly leaves, I wanted them to be identical, so I cleaned my stencil and flipped it over so they would mirror each other. I didn't want them to be different on each side. They have to be very specific. Shading it with Hauser Dark Green, and I'm using my Awesome Angle. I'll tell you, I used the Holly Helper. It's a template I created with holly leaves. I really am not a fan of painting holly leaves, but with the template, there's so many different sizes on it. It's just invaluable to use that. Going back with highlights of celery shoot on the top, pretty much top and left side on everything. But using the Holly Helper, it just makes creating holly leaves, just so simple, and they always turn out look so nice. I put holly leaves on the hat, holly leaves on the coat, add a dip dot of watermelon sliced berry, and then I put holly leaves on the boots. And they're all painted the same, foliage green, shaded with Hauser Dark, and highlighted with celery shoot. And I said foliage green, I did Hauser light green. I didn't add that shading on the face to begin with, but dried clay on the hands. And I went back and used Snow White just to sharpen up the strokes and put a little bit of sparkle everywhere. Use my chalk pencil to trace the decoration on the hat, and I didn't get to film that part, but it is all created using the Epic script liner and yellow ochre. Same thing on the medallion for the hat, yellow ochre, and then everything is shaded with light cinnamon and highlighted with Snow White. And look how that just makes that flat, boring dimension really pop out. When I painted the hat, I did the top and the bottom strokes first, and then one on each side, kind of like 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. And then I filled in between, and it helped to make them more even. And I'm using the white just to sharpen them up and make it look a little more dramatic. I used a stencil to create the stripes on the pants, but you could use a number 2 shader would be perfect. I wasn't sure I wanted stripes, but after I did it, I really liked how it turned out. And it just added a little more design. I wasn't sure it needed it, but boy, it really dressed it up. This is how he turned out. Love the way he looked. Decided on the base to go ahead and paint that melon, top coat with watermelon slice, shade around the outer edge with deep burgundy. And I did that. This is a 2-stack layered base. Gives a little more stability to the nutcracker. So I decided to paint both of them the same with the deep burgundy shading around the outer edge. Loved how it turned out. I tried different colors, but this looks so much better. Really wanted to dress it up. I decided to put the holly leaves, and I used my holly helper. You see the little dots around the outer edge where the center is, so I could space them out. And I wanted to put a set of leaves in between these, but there was not enough room. So I decided just to make those leaves bigger. So I bumped up the size, and I'm glad I did because it really makes them look, they stand out so much more. I think with all the detail on the soldier, little tiny leaves would have been too fussy. Now, it didn't line up perfectly. There was a little place on each one of the leaves I had to go back and clean up, but I just took my watermelon slice and just cleaned up the edges. So if something doesn't go quite right, it can always be fixed. It's never a issue that has to be, if anything else, just flip it over and paint the other side. But usually it can be manipulated, and sometimes it ends up being a better, I call it happy accident. Sometimes it ends up being a better solution. I'm much happier with these larger leaves than the smaller leaves, so it worked out well. Shading it with Hauser Dark Green using my 1/8 inch Awesome Angle. It has that extra length so I can get quite a bit of shading. I did go back, the first time I shaded it lightly, the second time I went back just reinforced that shading, adding the celery shoot highlights, just really ramps it up and sharpens those tips. When they're stencils, sometimes they look stenciled, but by the time all the shading and highlighting is added, it just looks very, very hand painted. Now, when I dip dotted the berries, I wanted to make sure they were going to really stand out. So I shaded underneath all of the holly leaves with that deep burgundy, adding dip dots and comma strokes with yellow ochre to dress it up. And I did use a fatter handle end of my brush to dip dot the berries watermelon slice. Now they do blend in, so I kind of switched my shading and highlighting around so that the highlighted part was against that dark burgundy shading and the light part The watermelon slice part I shaded with deep burgundy. Added some Snow White highlights on the berries, and they really make them pop and stand out. After I did that, I thought, well, maybe these little dip dots needed to be sparkled up as well. So I added Snow White on the dip dots. It was a great solution. I loved how they turned out. Really stand out and kind of sparkle. And then after I did that, I put a little bit more on the berries, and then I thought, you know, this base needed to be brightened up as well. So I added just a tiny bit of highlight across the top of those comma strokes, and I just used my stylus to dip dot and pull down, and you get a perfect little comma stroke. Super easy to do that. It's not fussy, but boy, you can see what a difference the ones that have white on them, how much brighter and just more professional, dimensional they look. It's such an easy way to dress up these comma strokes without much fuss, or it's not time consuming, and it just looks fantastic. So I can go around the edge very quickly. I removed all of the tracing lines and sealed each piece with ultramatte varnish. After that was completely dry, I arranged the pieces and secured them in place with quick grip adhesive. It's a great glue, doesn't take long to set up, and it holds it extremely well. I did not glue the nutcracker into the base. I thought having it separate would make for better storage. Everything I used is listed below. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. If you like what you see, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. That way you won't miss out on future videos. I hope you learned a few new tips, tricks, and techniques to make your painting life a little easier and a lot more fun. Remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together.